Trigger warning. Discussion of suicide, self-harm, and sexual assault. This show is about a teenage girl's suicide as told by the neighborhood boy who survived her. The suicide shocked and horrified him as well as the rest of the community. In the aftermath, he struggles to piece together what caused her to commit suicide. All he has to go off of are his own memories, as well as the scraps of her life she left behind. And this marks the premise of the show. Can he figure out why she committed suicide? This is the description of two wholly separate shows that I want to compare today, 13 Reasons Why and The Virgin Suicides. These shows are incredibly different from one another. 13 Reasons is a 2016 TV show, while The Virgin Suicides is a 1999 movie. One is set in contemporary times while the other is a period piece. One finds an answer while the other remains unanswerable. But, despite these differences, they also share a lot of similarities as demonstrated by their nearly identical premises. Both shows depict a female tragedy, that being the suicides of the Lisbon sisters in The Virgin Suicides and the suicide of Hannah Baker in 13 Reasons Why. Both shows also frame the suicides as events that have already happened prior to the beginning of the show. The opening shot of the first episode of 13 Reasons Why is of the memorial on Hannah Baker's locker, while The Virgin Suicides reveals that the Lisbon sisters will die by minute 2 of the movie. But the real interesting thing, which this video is going to focus on, is that the point of view character in both stories is the neighborhood boy who observed her life before she died. Both stories' narrators try to piece together the reasons for the suicide, but there's one major difference. 13 Reasons is unquestioning, while The Virgin Suicides is not. What are they about? 13 Reasons Why follows high schooler Clay after his classmate and friend Hannah Baker commits suicide. She leaves 13 cassette tapes behind, having them secretly passed around a group of people she labels as her quote-unquote 13 reasons for committing suicide. Each tape is about a certain person and the role they played in her decision. Hannah herself narrates these tapes, telling the listener about how her life spiraled amidst rumors, stalkers, and sexual assault, resulting in her decision. Clay, the point of view character, listens to the tapes as he tries to figure out who to blame for Hannah's suicide, while seeing the repercussions the tape is having on the people she blamed. The Virgin Suicides is the story of 5 sisters' suicides, as told by the boys who live in their neighborhood. The Lisbon daughters, Therese, Mary, Bonnie, Lux, and Cecilia, aged 13 to 17, are raised by strict, religious Catholic parents and are renowned across the neighborhood for their beauty and their secludedness. To the neighborhood boys who narrate the story, their seclusion makes them enticing and interesting, and they spend a lot of time fantasizing about them. The boys get drawn in further after the youngest daughter, Cecilia, slits her wrists and weeks later commits suicide. The boys follow the girls for months, as the parents become more strict and the girls get more secluded, until they're finally invited over to the girls' house in the middle of the night to quote-unquote free them. They're greeted by Lux, who tells them to wait for 5 minutes since they had to wait for their parents to fall asleep before they got ready. The boys hear a noise in the basement, so they follow and find one of the daughters dead, quickly realizing that all the sisters have killed themselves. They flee the house, collecting the family's belongings from the trash, and try to understand why the Lisbon daughters committed suicide, still obsessed with it decades later. Initial thoughts. And that's how the shows end, with the deaths of the girls. Immediately, the shows beg the same questions of the audiences. Why did they kill themselves? That's the first question I was left with at the end of the shows. The Virgin Suicides had me wondering about the controlling parents. Had Cecilia's earlier suicide condemned the rest of the sisters to follow her? Were they depressed? Did any of them have to be convinced, or were they all equally determined? Was it spontaneous or planned? And why did Lux go last? 13 Reasons Why had me wondering similar things, asking myself which person was most to blame, or if it was all equally distributed amongst all of them. How could the role of a rapist and the role of someone who stole a few happy notes to Hannah be compared? But there's no answers to the questions. Suicide is a complex, multifaceted health issue that rarely has any answers, much less in a fictional story. And I knew that. But that didn't stop me from pondering it in my head, imagining how their last few days might have gone, trying to piece together their thoughts with only the most surface level hints to help me. You can see how easily the boys got sucked into the girls' lives. The virgin suicide boys spent the next decades obsessing over it and trying to solve it, even if the pieces could never add up. And Clay, from 13 Reasons Why, spends the whole show asking himself the same questions. And we, the 2022 audience, also understand that the reason isn't really the point. This isn't a whodunit, giving the audience just enough hints to catch the killer before the detective can figure it out. It's not true crime because it's not true. Unlike real-life mysteries, this one is fictional. Not to mention, it's about suicides, meaning the killer is known. What they're looking for is motive, and the question is whether or not there's enough pieces to put it together. Beautiful creatures. The majority of glimpses we have to understand the girls is from the neighborhood boys' perspective. It's a very pinnacle, on-the-nose male gaze. The male gaze is the idea that the way audiences watch a movie is from the male perspective. Male screenwriters write female characters, male directors direct female actors and guide the camera. Scenes are edited to reflect men's interests and how they see the world. Even women behind the camera, who have studied under men and have adapted to industry standards, are perpetuating the male gaze. The neighborhood boys acting as our guide to the world is a literal narrative male gaze. The way the audience sees the girls is through their eyes. In The Virgin Suicides, they see the girls as sexual objects, and so do we, the audience. They're introduced with a rock song listing out their names and ages and called beautiful creatures. The creatures part always stuck out to me because that's really how the boys see them. Not as girls or neighbors, classmates or crushes, but beautiful creatures. They're beyond our understanding. Already, there's something other than human beings to these boys, and the audience sees them like that too. 13 Reasons Why also does this, albeit less obviously. Aside from the audio tapes, the only way we see Hannah is through Clay's memories. Even though they're presented neutrally, without the rock music and graphics of the Virgin Suicides, it's still a biased account of who Hannah was. The Hannah we see in the flashbacks is the version of Hannah that Clay saw. Honestly, it's hard to figure out how much we should trust the flashbacks. If Hannah is telling the story, then it's her interpretation of events. But Clay is clearly the point of view character in other flashbacks, making it possible that he's interpreting Hannah's events of what happened. We know the point of view isn't neutral, based on episode 7 when the cameras show a character throwing a letter on the ground, only to have it later be revealed that the letter was never thrown away. So we have to ask, whose perspective are we seeing in the flashbacks? Clay's or Hannah's? Or Clay's assumptions of Hannah? And while he never says anything as blatant as calling her a beautiful creature, he instead goes in the opposite direction, believing he now understands her. And while the show takes its time to break down what Clay's view of Hannah is, he still leaves the certainty that he knows Hannah, to the degree that he has hallucinations of her, a literal figment of his imagination. Bringing this back to why it matters, the memories they have of the girls and the assumptions they made of them based off of their belongings are vital to telling the audience about who they were and why they did what they did. While The Virgin Suicide makes a point of showing how unreliable the boys are as narrators, 13 Reasons Why tries for the most part to present the flashbacks as a neutral third party, a simple witness to the tragedy of Hannah Baker. In essence, both stories are being told by third parties, but The Virgin Suicide shows the flaws of that method, while 13 Reasons Why tries to gloss over them. Enigma. Both stories are fictional, but the point of one is to figure out the motive for a suicide, while the point of the other is to realize the absurdity of that. 13 Reasons Why is a fictional story, but the point of it is for the audience to figure out the motive of Hannah's suicide. Watch the next episode and you'll find out why Hannah did it. In the end, the motives are discovered as some people are deemed innocent and others guilty, some more than others, for Hannah's death. And some characters do question Hannah's ability to do it. Can she even be rational enough about her own suicide to list out the reasons in an ordered list? Can suicide be a rational thing? But the show never really takes the time to consider that question, generally implying any character who does ask those questions is just trying to wrongfully throw off their guilt. Clay even doubles down on the assumption that Hannah was able to rationally list out her motivations for committing suicide, and the guidance counselor doesn't really offer any substantial arguments to that idea. But The Virgin Suicides is the opposite. We see the neighborhood boys try to figure out why the lesbians committed suicide for sure. They steal Cecilia's diary and interpret her as a manic person living outside of reality. They collect every kind of evidence they can find, trying to find meaning and make sense of them. From their perspective, the question of the lesbian's suicide is left unanswered, but remains answerable, an enigma calling to them. But, unlike 13 Reasons Why, the Virgin Suicides frames this quest as hollow, meaningless, and a part of the male gaze. We're explicitly being fed the viewpoint of middle-aged men, retelling their teenage memories 20 years later, still trying to put the pieces together. And the audience can realize that the boys are unreliable narrators. They didn't really know the lesbians. Sure, they fantasized about them, speculated and used the most surface-level insights to draw grand conclusions about their lives, but their perceptions and reality aren't the same. Sure, the boys might think they are, but the audience can realize they aren't. 13 Reasons Why doesn't share the same perspective. Hannah's suicide is a mystery that can be solved. There is an answer to the question of why she committed suicide, and finding that answer is a meaningful journey. As Clay and the other characters learn what role they've played in her decision, they grow as people, becoming plagued by guilt or terrified of the public vitriol they'll face. When one of the characters attempts to commit suicide after hearing the tapes, it's a horrible consequence. But the framing of Hannah's suicide as a solvable mystery, with the tapes acting as the keys that can solve it, makes the character's actions look like a step on the same meaningful journey the rest of the characters took, despite it being too extreme. Unreliable narrators can add complexity to a fictional story. The Virgin Suicides does this by showing a dissonance between the real lives of the lesbians and the neighborhood boys' fictitious perception of it. Because the entirety of the movie is told through the boys' narration, we'll never know what reality looked like. There are hints, as well as Cecilia's diary, which shows lesbian sisters as normal girls going about their normal lives. But the elaborate fantasies the boys thought their lives were like? Yeah, they're not real, it's all made up. And after watching 13 Reasons Why, I struggled to not ask the same questions. There's also a dissonance in 13 Reasons, but that's more between Clay's perception of who Hannah is at the beginning, when he doesn't know why she committed suicide, and Hannah at the end, when he does know. Even though the flashbacks are mostly framed as neutral, rather than being from a certain perspective, it makes you question the accuracy, and if Clay is very different from the neighborhood boys in the Virgin Suicides, endlessly circling around the same scraps of a girl's life, trying to find meaning in it. The only difference is that the Virgin Suicides understands that it is meaningless, while 13 Reasons Why does not. Romanticization. The romanticization of suicide is a horrifying phenomenon, but one that has unfortunately left its mark in both the Virgin Suicides and 13 Reasons Why. However, once again, the Virgin Suicides frames the romanticization through the male gaze, while 13 Reasons Why acts as though it was not romanticizing it. 13 Reasons Why does this through the idea that Hannah got revenge when she committed suicide. All the characters feel guilty after listening to the tapes, so it depicts a way to get revenge on them by making them feel bad when there's nothing they can do about it. It's a dangerous fantasy, one that doesn't really occur in the real world. By creating meaning and rationality out of Hannah's suicide and depicting it as such, as well as showing the characters feeling guilty for their actions, it romanticizes suicide, which can become dangerous. Even more discomforting, Clay decides to help a girl, Sky, who he suspects of being depressed because he blames himself for not doing enough to help Hannah. Having good come out of Hannah's suicide is a chilling consequence of the romanticization approach it took to tell its story, as it shows that Hannah's actions have had positive impacts on others. Not to mention, the way her suicide was depicted on screen was problematic enough that Netflix actually edited it out of the show because of concerns that it was romanticized and too instructional. In the Virgin Suicides, it is the narrators who blatantly romanticize the suicides of the lesbians. The girls are beautiful and young, destined to stay that way forever. It's a tragic image, one that has been used before with the likes of Marilyn Monroe and other celebrities that died very young. However, the audience sees the dark side of this romanticization. The lesbians were forgotten about, aside from in whispers and by a group of middle-aged men they barely knew who stole their personal belongings and continued to fantasize about them. It's a creepy image, to say the least. The depictions of the suicides are very different as well. Cecilia's first attempt only shows her and the bloody bathwater. while the audience gets glimpses of the rest of the girl's later suicides: a pair of legs hanging from the rafters, a limp hand hanging out of a car. These brief descriptors are all that's needed for the audience to understand the horror of what has happened in the house. So, both shows do romanticize suicide, but it is clear to me that 13 Reasons Why does so to a much more dangerous degree, while the Virgin Suicide's depictions of romanticization are more unsettling and creepy. Titles. The dissonance between fantasy and reality is at the heart of both stories, even if 13 Reasons Why doesn't seem to know it. Even the titles of both shows hint at it. The quote-unquote virgin suicides because it's a false title, a complete lie. Lux was not a virgin when she committed suicide, so why is the story called that? And it's because the story isn't really about the Lisbon sisters, not really. It's about the neighborhood boys, how they're still obsessed, still fantasizing, and still fixated on the Lisbon sisters. It's about beautiful creatures, but never really about the tragically young lives of the sisters. To everyone, the girls' defining and most important trait was their virginity. That's the reason for their lifelong seclusion from the neighborhood, and the reason the boys are so curious about them, as well as the reason they were eventually isolated from everyone else. So is it really any surprise that the boys' story about them would be called the Virgin Suicides? And the same reasoning strikes a chord with 13 Reasons Why. Everyone believes there are 13 reasons why Hannah killed herself. Hannah herself believes it, and the whole show frames them as an indisputable key to unlock the mystery of why she did it. And I think this encapsulates the real tragedy of the show, which is the notion that it's trying to depict a rational suicide, which is arguably not a real phenomenon. There aren't really 13 reasons why Hannah committed suicide. It's most likely a barrage of brain chemistry, impulsive decision-making, the aftermath of sexual assault, and most likely, a severe case of depression. I'm no mental health expert, so I don't want to act like I am, but the way the 13 reasons are depicted does make it seem like it's a way for the characters themselves to rationalize an irrational action. It strikes me as an exercise in absurdity, and to call the whole show that is an extension of it. The real tragedy. The tragedy of these shows aren't the deaths themselves. They're sad, of course, and heartbreaking, the culmination of hundreds of different factors that no one will ever be able to piece together. The real tragedy is in how they're going to be remembered, not as confused and troubled teenage girls, but as beautiful creatures whose deaths will always be mulled over, despite the inherent absurdity of it. The Lisbon sisters' personal belongings are still being perused and held by strangers, their secrets read out loud, and even in death, they're still being fantasized about. Hannah Baker's suicide will be rationalized, and the characters named as reasons will have a meaningful growth as a consequence of it. So, my suggestion for anyone still wondering why either of them committed suicide is to stop. There's not a reason, not one that can be found by these shows anyways. All there are scraps of the girls' lives, distorted beyond recognition by memories, the male gaze, and the teenage fantasy of a neighbor. And as long as you're wondering, you are taking the neighborhood boys' fantasies for a fact, falling into the same trap they fell into long ago, obsessing over beautiful creatures that don't really exist. So, I would say just to let them rest. So, that's the end for me. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you're interested in kind of further stuff to watch after this, I would recommend just watching the Virgin Suicides movie. It's like criminally underrated. I didn't even hear about it until I stumbled on it by pure accident a few months ago. It was so good. Oh my god. 13 Reasons Why, on the other hand, is pretty terrible. There are a ton of videos on YouTube explaining why it's so terrible that I pretty much agree with wholeheartedly, but it's been talked about so often that I don't really want to spend that much time on it. So that's the end for me, I think, today at least. Yeah, I hope you liked, and maybe I'll catch you again later. Bye for now.